that before the onset of abuse, there were no more alcoholics, no more drug addicts, no more homelessness, no more HIV disease, no more depression or suicidality. By the way, domestic violence turned out to be the leading cause of suicide attempts by women of color. And many of these suicide attempts, 50% of these suicide attempts, occurred within days of a visit to the hospital for domestic violence, and often with the medication we had given them to cool them out. Yet there was no definition of no recognition of domestic violence in our system. And yet, so these problems developed in the context of ongoing abuse, often as a way to cope, often as a way to manage the stress. I know I can't control whether I'm going to be hurt. What I can control is how I'm going to be hurt. I can control that myself. So I'm going to do that. I call that control in the context of no control. Very important concept for social work, because if you're going into a home and you see negative behaviors, you need to be able to reframe those as survival strategies if they are, and build on the desire to be free and safe that those strategies represent, rather than to label women because you see those strategies. So this, anyway, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but I want you to understand that this is what we were looking at. And one of the things we found, first in our initial survey, and then in a separate study, was that domestic violence, lo and behold, men's domestic violence was the leading cause of child abuse, far and away more common than any other context or cause. Far and away. 45% of the mothers of abused children, all the abused children in the hospital for a year that we studied, and our work was subsequently replicated by a researcher named Eli Neuberger, who plays the tuba quite well. And I played accordion with him when he was playing the tuba, and he's a better tuba player than I am an accordion. I'm just saying that in case somebody knows Eli. I'm going to tell him I claimed any priority. But Eli Neuberger and his team at Harvard replicated our work, and what we found was almost half, he found half of the women whose children were daughter for abuse were themselves in abusive relationships. And we'll see in a moment that the offender in these cases was almost always the man. I'll come back to that in just a second, but what I wanted you to see was this was the model that we worked from. The idea is that domestic violence is a kind of assault. And in those days, people were only taking assault seriously if they were committed against strangers, so we wanted them to take assault seriously if they were committed against partners. So we thought, okay, it's an assault. Now, each assault in the criminal world, as you know, am I talking too fast? I have no accent, right? So each assault, as you know, is treated as a separate event, right? Let's remember that. This is going to come out, and it's going to be very, very important. This was the approach we took. And it made absolute sense to us that the more injury there was, the more serious the abuse, right? The more injury there was, the more serious abuse. And even if that didn't become official, New York City at the time had what they called informally the 10-stitch rule, that they didn't make an arrest in a domestic violence case unless the victim required 10 stitches. That wasn't official. That was just a way of rationing resources. It made sense. In the emergency room, when you're sitting there with thousands of patients, who's the one who's going to be taken most seriously? The one who's most seriously injured. If you have limited space in a shelter, or if you're a social worker worrying about an emergency in the case, who's going to get the most services or the most triage? That's going to be the person with the most serious injuries. It seemed to make sense. It turned out that all of this was wrong, but we didn't know that at the time. Of course, if we focused on injury, what that meant was this. If they didn't have any calls to the police or hospital visits, that probably meant it wasn't serious. Or if they stayed in an abusive relationship, or the violence wasn't severe, or they kept going and coming, or leaving and coming. In those days, I was treating abusive men as well as working with women in the shelters. And these guys did nothing but complain about their wives or their girlfriends. They said, oh, what a bitch, I'm this and that and that. And you have to ask these guys, if she's so terrible, why don't you leave? And it became really clear to us in the movement, which may not be clear to you, that the problem in these cases is always more difficult to get the guy out of the picture, which is one of the reasons we made the offense now 5 years in prison. Not a slap on the wrist. It's always more difficult to get the guy out of the picture, much more complicated to wonder why he's staying than to try to get her to leave. And I'm sure you've heard this again and again, leaving is an extremely dangerous time. And it's a dangerous time because women like Magdalena Luczek, who have been raped 3 times by the same guy, the guy is still in the community. So going to the police is no option. And we can talk about it more, but, or we condemn the women because they love him. They love him and insist on his innocence. I'll never forget a young Puerto Rican woman that I was counseling, can't remember, Maria Gonzalez. She had a long name. Can't remember the long name, but I remember her face. And I remember counseling her, and the other workers were very disappointed in Maria because we finally got her to call the police. Her partner was arrested. He was put in jail, and 2 weeks later she went down and bailed him out of jail. And then we found out he had weekend visitation at his hotel room with their 13-year-old daughter, and we found out that Maria was visiting him at the hotel. Oh, how frustrating it is when women don't do what you tell them, isn't it? Isn't it something else? We say in our movement, you're not going to understand this maybe if you're a social worker and working with children. We say in our movement that we know we've done a good job. When a woman leaves our office, and we know she's going to do the wrong thing, and we let her go. We let her go. We had a woman come to shelter a couple of months ago in New Jersey who hadn't been allowed because she made a mistake to wash her hair for 2.5 years. 2.5 years because she made a little mistake. So can you understand why letting women make mistakes is sometimes important? And she, right after dinner, would go upstairs because her hair was matted and filled with lice, and the children needed to be washed and stuff. And right after dinner, she would go upstairs with her 3 children and hide in her room. And one night, the other women invited her downstairs, and they had a hair-cutting celebration. And they surrounded her, and while she was weeping, they were cutting her hair, and each big strand that fell as they washed and cut her hair, they shouted, something about freedom. I don't know what. She doesn't speak hardly about 5 words in English, so I doubt she understood what was happening, the words, but she understood what was happening. There was a story I interrupted. What was this? Anybody remember what that was? To tell the story? Well, I'll remember it again. I cut it. Loving him. Loving him. But the one thing about loving, you know that a lot of these women want the relationship to change, the abuse to end, they want the man to change. And I was going to say this. And it's probably true. I can tell you from my own experience. I have stayed in relationships too long, some relationships, where I loved people and I tried to change them. I tried to help them and failed. I failed to remake them in my own image. And when I approach women who have stayed in relationships and taken the pain in order to change a man, I think that is a kind of love. And if I was a religious person, I would respect that kind of love, of taking the suffering of others and tolerating it in order to help them change them. I would respect that. And yet we're so quick to condemn women who do that. So what was happening under the current system? I'll just cut to the chase here because we want to move on as quickly as we can. What was happening was that when we looked at abuse through the prism of the violence model, we were trivializing it. We were normalizing it. What do I mean by that? Well, I'll just explain very quickly and later maybe we'll flash by the data. Remember I said that all assaults have to be treated as separate events? It turns out, even in the emergency room, even when people came in complaining of injuries, it's also a Trump thing, right? Even, I don't have the hair, if anybody has an extra wig. I wore the pussy hat during the demonstration against Trump. A woman in Sweden knitted this hat for me. Millions of us, 4.5 million in New York City, about 500,000 had hats. Not too many men, but I had this beautiful hat. But what we found, even in the emergency room, was that 95% of the women who came in complaining of injury did not have serious injuries. 95 to 98% of all domestic violence is trivial. Slaps, pushes, shoves, chokes, punches, kicks, hair pulling, nothing any of us want done to us, but not the kind of thing that's going to impress a police officer Not a kind of thing that's going to be charged, and certainly not something that's going to impress an emergency room doctor in the hospital. You understand what I'm saying? 95%. So if 95% of domestic violence episodes are trivial, from at least a medical or criminal justice standpoint, who's going to go to jail? Anybody? You're nodding your head. Who's going to go to jail? Speak, child. What? Nobody. And that's exactly what the data show us. Marianne Hesse's research in England shows that the attrition rate from a report of domestic violence to a conviction is 97%. That is, of the 14%, now it's higher because of the huge rise in reporting occasioned by the change in the definition and the cuts. The huge rise in domestic violence that has occurred in domestic violence reporting. Of the domestic violence reports, 97 out of 100 arrests and reports don't result in conviction. That means the guy gets away with it, right? And the 3 that do result in convictions, the typical sentence is a fine, not a custodial sentence. So when we go back to Magdalena, we see that the police were sending a message. And when Mariana asked men in Northumbria, where she studied thousands of police reports, what that message was, the message was, there's no punishment for domestic violence. And by the way, which we're going to talk about a little more, the same was true of rapes. 97 out of every 100 partner rapes that was reported to the police, and many of which resulted in arrest, because the vast majority of arrests in England for rape are partners. 97 out of every 100, the charges went away. There was no conviction, no custodial sentence, and if there was a conviction and a sentence, it was for the lesser offense of domestic violence. This was what was wrong. So we are spending all of our time, whether in social work or in the specialist services or we're in police, we're spending all of our time on, as is the victim, safety work. Why are we doing safety work? Because the man is still there. What have I done? I reported to police, I reported to social work, I reported to the school, all of these things that Magdalena did and other victims have done, and he's still there. He's still in the community. For every 100 of my sisters and my daughters and my mothers who were sexually assaulted, 3 will be punished. So rape is going to be allowed if you're a partner. Domestic violence is going to be allowed if you're a partner. And this is true even when there's a protection order, and what happens to police? And here we're going to move on to children, but what happens to police? What happens to social work? What happens to all of the professionals who continue to encounter these families is, as we see again and again and again and again, we return to the house of the 72 professionals, health visitors, social workers, teachers, pediatricians, who saw Magdalena Luczek and saw Daniel. They didn't see Marius. When we brought the Nicholson case in New York City, all cases were classified in the mother's name, even if she was dead. Well, my wife is saying, congratulations, you got there safely. She put me on a bus this morning. I felt like when I put my grandson on the bus. So it's amazing. So these things are happening right in our presence, right? And yet we're still working under the illusion that we have a crime of domestic violence, and no one is being punished for it.